A webcomic is media presented on the World Wide Web using images, usually in the form of a comic. I like to describe webcomics as comics where there isn't a physical connection between the panels and pages, but a digital one. Seeing as discussion is still open on what a comic exactly is, the sequential art definition has both its proponents and detractors, crafting a full definition of webcomic is kinda outside of the scope of this video. Webcomics are created by web cartoonists or webcomic creators, depending on how pretentious you want to sound. A good portion of webcomics are made by a writer-artist duo. Webcomics are presented on the World Wide Web, which allows you to view online images and media directly through a web browser, rather than having to manually download them. A website for a webcomic typically has an about page, a cast page, a link to an online shop, and a bonus content page. However, the most important page for any webcomic is the archives, from which you have easy access to every page or strip out thus far. Webcomics come in various formats. Many American web cartoonists have decided to render their story as though it was a newspaper strip or a traditional comic book. Others make use of the infinite canvas, a concept defined by Scott McCloud in 2000 and characterized by long, scrollable pages. The dimensions of a webcomic are undefined, unlike dimensions of a newspaper strip and comic book, so a webcomic can take any shape. Although MacLeod's implementation of the infinite canvas never really spread outside of a small group of aficionados, myself included, the concept itself has been widely applied, even if many people who make use of the infinite canvas today have never heard of MacLeod and his writings. Webtoon is a movement of webcomics originating in South Korea in 2005. Recognizing that the country's comic industry was lacking in innovation, Kyusam Kim founded the website Webtoon, which was immediately characterized by very tall, scrollable webcomics with a lot of negative space. Web portal Down quickly got in on the game, and the term Webtoon eventually became synonymous for South Korean webcomics in general. As Webtoon services became available worldwide in the early 2010s, English and French-speaking web cartoonists began creating their own webtoons, and influence of the form is still spreading. Meanwhile, in France, an entirely unique webcomic culture started to arise. France has always had a strong history of comics, which they call bande dessinée or BD. When the internet became robust enough, it didn't take long for people to create a blog BD, merging webcomics and blogs. Rather than focusing on short gags or complex storylines like the Americans and Koreans were doing, the French simply drew out the events of their daily lives. This format became so popular that an annual festival was launched in 2005, then called Festiblog. French webcomics fall under BD numérique or digital comics. In both France and the United States, digital comics have become a popular yet nebulous market for larger companies. When Marvel presented their own take of motion comics in 2009, reception was mixed. But on the other hand, the Overwatch digital comic series has generally been praised. Webcomics is still primarily the domain of independent web cartoonists. This became especially apparent when, in 2009, French web cartoonist Balak identified the Turbo Media, a webcomic format where the reader can view one panel at a time, as though they were looking at a slideshow. This format has become fairly popular in France, albeit in small circles. But similar things have been done in English language webcomics for years, like in Dan Miller's Kid Rat and MacLeod's The Right Number. While Balak and those he influenced use Adobe Flash to create Turbo Media, American contemporaries use regular hyperlinks for similar effects. Which leads me to the last webcomic unique genre/format I'd like to talk about today, the adventure webcomic. Popularized by Weaver and Andrew Hussey and also called interactive comics, adventures typically show a reader one panel at a time as well, though they combine these with one or more paragraphs of text. In an adventure webcomic, the readers can give the characters commands and the writer needs to interpret these in an interesting manner. Of course, one could write books about many of the concepts I have described in the past few minutes. This is not an exhaustive description of what webcomics are. This is merely a glossary of the language that has sprung up around webcomics, and a jumping off point for your own research. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you feel so inclined, and DFTBA.